Good morning, and welcome to this Atlantic Council panel event, Modernizing the Power Grid for a Resilient Future. I'm Philip Cornell, the Senior Fellow at the Atlantic Council Global Energy Center and a Principal at the Economist Intelligence Unit. This event is part of the Atlantic Council's Raising Ambitions event series, which focuses on the higher climate ambitions that the Biden-Harris administration hopes to realize at home and abroad. It will evaluate key technologies critical to helping reach those goals, emphasize sectoral approaches to decarbonization, and highlight countries increasing their commitments to climate action. The aim is to build momentum in advance of the summit and encourage increased ambition from public and private sector actors around these topics, with today's focus being on grid modernization and resilience. The fundamental nature of the electric power system is changing around the world, necessitating major investments in the grid to integrate large shares of variable renewable energy, to enhance resilience in the face of rising operational risks from climate change and cybersecurity threats, to facilitate the rise of distributed energy resources such as EVs, storage, and localized generation, to leverage digital and cloud technologies to respond to changing customer demands, and to connect distant renewable resources across borders, continents, and even oceans. When it comes to the clean energy transition and achieving ambitious net zero targets, zero carbon power generation is already the cheapest electricity in most cases, even dropping to 1 cent per kilowatt in a recent power purchase agreement. The real cost now is in connecting, managing, and delivering that power reliably in a variety of market and national contexts around the world. Emerging markets will need to respond to rising demand, and mature systems to increasing electrification across the economy by transforming the existing asset stock. Ultimately, grid modernization is about delivering a reliable zero carbon electricity future with flexibility in both transmission and distribution, while accommodating a proliferation of technologies, complexities, and stakeholders. So to discuss all these issues, I'm delighted to welcome an esteemed and global panel this morning. Duncan Burt is Director for COP26 at National Grid UK and former Vice Chair of the European System Operations Committee. Francisco Munoz Espinoza is Director of Research at Generadores de Chile, Chile's Electrical Power Generators Association. Nguyen Phuong Mai is Deputy Chief of Office at the Electricity and Renewable Energy Authority of the Vietnamese Ministry of Industry and Trade. Leo Simonovich is Vice President and Global Head of Industrial, Cyber, and Digital Security at Siemens Energy. And finally, Benny Shiradi is Manager for Power, Fossil Fuels, Alternative Energy and Storage at the ACE, which is the ASEAN Center for Energy. So thank you to all of you for joining us. To the audience, just to let you know the running order here, after some opening questions and discussions, I'd like to turn to Q&A from you. So please use the chat function on the bottom of your screen to submit questions throughout this session. And we will be sure to answer them and put them to our participants. We're holding this discussion, as we mentioned, in the run-up to the Biden administration's Leaders Summit on climate next week, which is an important point on the road to COP26 in November. And so let me start maybe with you, Duncan. Countries have been announcing very ambitious targets in the run-up to COP, led by the UK. Is a fully decarbonized grid possible? And what are the implications for grid modernization and its financing in the UK and also in other countries, such as the ones where National Grid operates?
Hi, Philip. Good morning, everyone, and thanks for having me on. To answer your question directly, yes, very high renewables grid, a zero carbon grid is technically possible. We're very close to seeing the first contiguous grids go to zero carbon. We see Denmark, Scotland, and Portugal already in Europe operating regularly at ultra low levels of CO2. And in the UK, we have a commitment to be able to operate the power grid at zero carbon by 2025. So we know the technical pathways that we need to get there. and we want to get there quickly and early. As you say, we're seeing a number of global commitments, of which the UK and France are in the vanguard. But we've seen China and really ambitious targets in the US now, which is fantastic. But we see electricity and power grids right at the front of that decarbonisation pathway, because as many of the people on this call know, firstly, you decarbonise the power grid, and then you use that energy, that low carbon energy, to then help decarbonise transport, industry, and all your heating and cooling. So that ladder of decarbonisation is, in Europe, certainly showing us certain things. One, your grids are getting bigger. We're seeing a much greater level of interconnection, and grids moving to a continental scale, because that gives them the geographic spread to handle some of the variability that you get in weather at a regional level, whether you're in California or in Spain. Secondly, we're seeing a huge penetration of lithium-ion batteries onto those grids. The further north you go, the more relevant they are for within-day variability. As you get into warmer climes, they're really managing the mismatch between that solar peak at midday and continued heating and cooling demand through the evening, where batteries can fill some of that gap. And at a deeper technical level, there are a number of issues with both the development and the operating of ultra-low carbon grids. You've mentioned a couple there. Some of these long distance connections that you need to get to high levels of renewables from remote areas where it's easier to build them. And also really detailed technical points around the way that power grids behave differently when you've got very light solar and wind generators on it, compared to sort of big old heavy coal and gas generators fueling the power grid. But those technical issues are understood. We're well on the way to achieving that in the UK, and in many other countries around the world, we see a very similar pathway. I think I'm happy to sit here and bust most of the myths that you'll have read in the papers over the last 15 years about the risks and threats that these face, and the fact that you can't do it. We absolutely know at National Grid that's not the case. But there's a lot to do, as you say. A lot of that is investment in network and in interconnection, be that state to state or nation state to nation state, to help enlarge the grids, both to smooth out the renewables and to give you the scale of network that you need to transport that rise in electricity demand that we're going to see. At the moment, a typical electricity network carries around 20-25% of a modern economy's energy demands. In the future, as we go through decarbonisation, that 20 to 25 is likely to rise to 50-60% of total energy supplied to the economy, maybe even for some as high as 70-75%. And that will require investment in the fundamental infrastructure, the solar panels, the wind farms, the nuclear, if you're doing that, such as in China and the UK, and it will require investment in everything else we're going to touch on today. So the networks that carry that, the distribution networks that supply it, the IT and the markets and the data platforms that will support that working resiliently and reliably. But to wrap up really quickly, what we do already know is that we have within reach all the technology to do that. Innovation can help tremendously, get there faster and cheaper, but we can do it with the existing technologies that we already have. And from an investment perspective, certainly in the UK, we have the right certainty around regulatory regimes and supportive structures to get there using our own finance that we can raise on the debt and equity markets. Clearly, those challenges exist elsewhere around the world where the scale is either larger or faster, but we'll leave those for the discussion today. So I'll just close with the fact that, ultra high renewables, very low carbon grids are here. They are achievable at sensible cost and in a reliable and resilient way. And with that, Philip, I'll pass back to you.
Thanks very much, Duncan. I was happy to see you, mention the global carbon commitments in Europe and the fact that given the rising amount of electrification, we're going to need huge amounts of investment, even in mature economies where demand growth might not be booming, but certainly demand for electricity is going to see a huge rise in the coming years. But let me turn to another region with ambitious commitments as well, and also a country that's showing a lot of leadership. Chile is hosting this year the Clean Energy Ministerial. And so, Francisco, maybe I can turn to you. I mean, Chile is really leading the way on large-scale solar power, and we heard now from Duncan some of the challenges around managing solar peaks, demand changes, long-distance transmission that might be related to solar. Um, integrating that kind of levels of intermittent generation requires a lot of major investments. How is a country like Chile planning to accommodate that?
Thank you. So that's correct. Accommodating high levels of intermittent generation will require massive investments in new transmission infrastructure. And this applies not only to Chile, but to most power grids where the best renewable resources are far from the main load centers and the existing grid. So I think there are three main challenges to network investments, not just in Chile, but I think in most places in the world. The first one is that transmission lines can be costly, and particularly in systems that cover wide geographic areas. Second is that transmission lines can take much longer to build than generation infrastructure. And the third issue is related to the public acceptance of these projects. People like some renewable generation projects, but they don't like having high voltage lines nearby. So I think here are some recommendations to address or reduce some of these challenges. The first one is to avoid building lines that are unnecessary. And you can accomplish that by providing locational price signals for efficient generation siting. For example, use nodal pricing to guide investments in generation capacity to the locations where these resources provide the greatest value to the system. And this can help avoid building transmission infrastructure that is not cost effective. A second part of a strategy is to take advantage of non-wire solutions. So, for example, make the best use of existing transmission infrastructure through software and grid enhancing technologies. So, for example, modern dispatch software can result in a much more efficient use of existing transmission infrastructure than, say, heuristics. And grid enhancing technologies such as dynamic line ratings can also allow the existing grid to accommodate more generation from renewables without the need for new investments. We're also considering unlocking the existing transmission with capacity with storage. Today, a large fraction of transmission capacity is used to meet security constraints and cannot be used to transport power between different locations. And large storage devices located in strategic parts of the network are much easier and faster to develop than large transmission projects. And in some cases, they can be used to free some transmission capacity. And last but not least, I'll say we're thinking about being strategic about planning and about communicating the need for new transmission infrastructure. We need to plan proactively, considering multiple scenarios. Transmission lines take much longer to build than generation infrastructure. So if possible, it's better to plan for transmission in anticipation instead of as a response to generation investment. And in addition, transmission investment alternatives should be assessed against multiple future scenarios of generation developments and market conditions. So this strategy can help planners identify robust or least regret investment strategies. The last part about communication, I'll say a good strategy would be to consider a national strategy to help developers secure, for example, rights of way and negotiate transmission line easements, just like we did with highways, for example. Given the scale of transmission investments that will be needed to accommodate investments in renewables, it's unlikely that private investors or developers will be able to conduct all negotiations bilaterally at the speed that is necessary to decarbonize the grid in the next 3 decades.
Thanks very much, Francisco. Indeed, I mean, transmission investments are not only costly, but have another cost in terms of public investment. So how we can invest in flexibility resources to avoid those kind of unnecessary transmission investments are key. And you mentioned, I also like to assessing transmission investment needs against future scenarios. And that can be particularly challenging in environments where that future scenario includes a huge amount of growth. Vietnam, for example, maybe I can turn to Mai. Vietnam is an emerging market with rapidly growing demand. We saw 10% annual growth for a decade to 2019, and ambitious plans to respond with lower carbon supply, notably in the National Power Development Plan. Mai, what are the grid requirements for quality energy access, for meeting that growing power demand, and incorporating clean energy in the context of rapid development like Vietnam's?
Yes, firstly, again, I'd like to say very good morning to everyone. And thank you for giving me the chance to share about the Vietnam situations. To answer your question, may I share my presentations where I will brief introduce about the renewable development situations in Vietnam, and also the need for expand and improve for the transmission system to accelerate more renewable in the coming future. Yes, in this presentation, firstly, in the first part, I would give the overview on the renewable developments in Vietnam. And the second part, there would be the plan for renewable and the grid developments, which is shown in the power development plans number 8, we call PDP 8. And lastly, I will mention about the opportunities and challenges that we are facing right now. Firstly, regarding the renewable situations in the last 3 years in Vietnam has increased rapidly. So this is the figure shown by end of 2020, where the renewables share is up to 25.3%. Here is not include hydropower, because we already explore most of the big hydropower, which is share about more than 30% in the total power mix. And the renewable I mentioned here mostly come from solar and partly from wind power, and a small part is biomass. Here in this slide, I'd like to introduce more detail about the last 3 years developments. Firstly, regarding the solar, since we apply the feed-in tariff, is very attractive for the investor at the rate of 9.35 US cent per kilowatt hours. That is why we can call for a big number of the projects to be invested since 2018 until now. So in the last 3 years, you see the number of the projects keep increasing, and the total capacities reached to more than 8.6 thousands megawatt. Besides, we also have very good mechanism to encourage for the PV rooftop. That is why we, in the last 2 years, the number of the rooftop projects, actually it's from the households and the farm mostly, are also increased very fast. And the wind powers is a little bit smaller, only 11 projects are in operation right now, and small part are from biomass and waste to energy. And the total installed capacity for the renewables until now is reached 17,380 megawatt. This chart shows the how we attract for the renewable energy developments. We set the feed-in tariff for each type of the renewable source, which is wind, biomass, waste to energy, and solar. And since it is the encouraging mechanism, that is why we put in the certain duration of time. For example, for the onshore and offshore wind power, the deadline, I mean the commotion it must be put in operations by the 1st of November 2021. And the rate is rather high right now. For the onshore, it's 8.5 US cent per kilowatt hours. And for the offshore, it is a little bit higher at 9.8 US cent per kilowatt hours. For the solar PV, we also have very encouraging feed-in tariff. But recently, before 2019, the rate is 9.35. But in the last year, we already adjust the feed-in tariff. We call feed 2, and we devise for 2 types of the floating solar. The rate is 7.69 US cent per kilowatt hours, and for the rooftop, it's 8.38 US cent per kilowatt hours. And those feed-in tariff is support for the governments to call for quite a number of the investors to come. And besides many local investors also work with the solar projects. Regarding the transmission line, this table will show the how the network we have right now in Vietnam. We have the KV line along the countries, and beside we have the system of 220 kV and 110 kV. And the total length of those lines are nearly 25,000 kilometers. But we also have number of the substations. However, this is not enough to evacuate and support to transmit all the power around the countries, because you can see the map of Vietnam. We have the long countries, and the demands area and the potential of the power area is a little bit far away. That is why the transmission become a challenge. And especially in the short time when the increase of the renewable projects increase rapidly in a short time, cause the burdens and very constraints of the evacuations for the power from those projects to the demand area. In this table, I would like to show a little bit about the grid management. In the last few years, we apply a lot of new technologies to improve the qualities of the grid management and control for the power distribution surrounding the countries. However, I think this is not enough. We need to work more to maximize the qualities and to keep the stable for the whole system while accelerating more renewables in the coming years. Now I would like to introduce a little bit about the PDP number 8. I would emphasize on the renewable development. So far, we already complete the final draft of the PDP 8 and submitting to the Prime Minister to approve. However, we are still waiting for the approval. So this number is from our final draft. And with this plan, you can see up to the year 2030, we would increase the solar power to 14%, and the wind power to 13% of the total installed capacity. And in the far future, up to 2040, the total number of solar and wind power would reach to 45%. And at the same time, we are considering to have new gas and LNG powers in the system, because we used to have some of the coal power plant, and because we are working on the energy transitions, which would reduce the share of the coal and also reduce the share of the fossil fuel. That is why the most important policy is to encourage and promote for the renewable energies. And solar and wind is the most potential source in Vietnam. That is why we need to improve the mechanism to facilitate for solar and wind developments in the near future. For the grid developments, we also make a plan in the 2030 for the new um, transmission line at the 500 kV and 220 kV, and also we need to build numbers of the substations accordingly. So this slide showed our expectations target that we would achieve in the year of 2030. So according to this figure, so each year we need to have about 8,000 MVA for 500 kV substations and 8,040 MVA for 220 kV substation. So this target is double of the situations that we are doing now. So we need to have great efforts to make it happen. And at the same time, for the grid line, we need to work at least double or 3 times harder than right now to meet the target that we set for the 2030. Here, this is for the short-term visions last year and this year. Every year we set very clear target to achieve our plan. So this target is very ambitious. However, we try our best to make it happen. We are facing issues of the financial arrangement for the transmission and substations projects, because right now the EVN, that means Electricity of Vietnam Corporation, that is the state-owned enterprise to own and operate for all the transmission line all around the countries, and it's not any private sector to could invest in this line. That is why the funds or the financial from the government budget is quite limited. That is called some challenge for us. So we need to work with many international organizations to get the reasonable funds or ODAs or use different type of the financial mechanisms to support for this kind of very difficult infrastructure development. We have the great potential for renewable, and now the technology's price is getting cheaper, and we somehow gain some experience. However, the most difficult is the power grid. That is the most challenging issues that we are facing now. So I just mentioned earlier that we need to have more support and many great efforts from our own abilities to make it happen. I think that I may stop here, and I would share more at the Q&A sections when you have any questions to my presentations. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Mai. Clearly, you showed the role and the challenges of long distance transmission in a country with Vietnam's geography, maybe similar to some of the challenges that we see in Chile. And you talked mostly about wind and solar and sort of the predominance of the resources there. But you did mention a bit at the beginning about hydropower, which is a major source of renewable energy in Southeast Asia and a principal alternative to coal, but it's also clearly concentrated around, for example, the upper Mekong. Exporting that renewable resource on a regional basis has a lot of potential. Leo, we've heard, from the speakers already, some of the, the alternatives to sort of large build out and transmission, other places where we can find, flexibility resources in the grid. And clearly there's major changes happening around on the transmission side, but also further down on the distribution side. With a lot of stakeholders taking part in generation and storage and digitized grid management. Last week, I saw that Google sponsored a new venture to coordinate a pan-European flexibility market. What does the challenges of this new sort of complex environment, all of these new players, pose from a cybersecurity and operational risk perspective?
Yeah, thanks for that question, Phil. I think it gets to the heart of both the challenges and the opportunities that we're up against when thinking about grid resiliency. And especially when it comes to a far more digitally connected and technologically diverse ecosystem that frankly is already here today. When we talk about security, I think it's helpful for me to set the stage for the megatrends that are driving the need for more sophisticated cybersecurity solutions, particularly in operating environments. I'd like to start this, this conversation with a quick analogy that many in the audience are familiar with. Before the smartphones, and yes, some of us still remember this time, telephones and the telecom businesses were all about landlines and wires. But within a few years of the smartphone being in the hands of billions of people across the globe, the core value proposition of telephone companies changed. All of a sudden, phone companies went from securing landlines to delivering secure data on demand to consumer devices whenever and wherever they happen to be. A similar revolution is happening in the energy industry. It is affecting everything from charging your car at home to commercial energy batteries in office buildings. Each of these innovations call for more sophisticated digital controls that our panelists have talked about to ensure grid stability. And that means for our future energy systems to function, utility companies need to reinvent and secure the entire energy ecosystem. This is especially the case when looking at the downstream distribution side of the energy sector, where consumers, or as commonly known, prosumers, are interacting with physical energy assets and software applications. In turn, exponentially widening what's hackable and how, with consequences for the whole connected system. The new grid functions with internet-like speeds, communication and interconnectivity, and less like electrons moving down a one-way street from power plant to consumer. In this model, customers become engaged producers, and utilities' role is less about providing power and more about safeguarding the networks and the ecosystem that moves power from where it's available to where it's needed. And as you mentioned, over very long distances. So, the question is, how do we secure this new energy ecosystem? And I'll be brief here because we'll want to get into the discussion, but the core challenge of protecting critical infrastructure from cyber attacks is the complexity of monitoring, gathering, analyzing, and then acting on intelligence. Companies need to detect and respond to cyber attacks before they cause damage. Though many are currently are not up to the task due to technological and resource constraints. At its most basic level, energy companies are incapable of defending what they can't see. Cybersecurity for energy companies begins with context and visibility. Once companies gain that visibility and context, they can monitor and detect threats and eliminate them before they scale. So that means that the industry must deploy solutions that can see across the grid's entire operating environment. But the big question is, well, how do we do that? Well, in two words, artificial intelligence. While it's definitely not the panacea nor the menace that some make it out to be, AI-based monitoring and detection solutions provide a unified picture of anomalous behavior for defenders with actionable insights to stop attacks. And yet, many of these solutions are out of reach for most energy companies. While some large players have begun deploying AI-based security solutions at scale, mid-sized companies and many folks in the developing world do not have the sufficient resources and developing budgets to pursue these complex projects in-house. So, in my view, to deploy and scale emerging technologies like AI and blockchain, we really need to be looking at building a new innovative based security architecture. I wrote about this in an article for the Atlantic Council's Global Energy Forum this past winter. But in short, the industry needs to build stronger public-private partnerships. Collaboration with federal, state, and cross-border governments can help companies drive down risk, overcome investment hurdles, and improve deployment-ready technologies. Shortening the technology adoption cycle will help our industry, which is frankly pretty risk averse. It's about safety and reliability, right? Uptake new and emerging technologies like AI. And for that, we need capital, grants, loans that will give the industry the edge to scale and stay ahead of attackers. Back to you, Phil.
Yeah, thanks so much, Leo. That's really fascinating, and clearly from a utility perspective, there's an increasing threat environment out there. I wonder, as the role of cloud computing takes on much more of a role in facilitating things like peer-to-peer exchange and distribution level markets. Are we seeing? You mentioned sort of things becoming less secure because of more entry points, and that's a sort of a narrative that we've heard a lot about. But as some of this, computing goes to, cloud computing services with a lot of dedicated security, are we actually seeing things become more secure or less secure? Is that cybersecurity responsibility staying with the same stakeholders, or is it shifting as the grid shifts?
Yeah, I think we've seen a real bifurcation of both responsibility and also security. The reality is that there are new entrants, prosumers, renewable energy companies that are disrupting the energy ecosystem. And a lot of the intelligence is either moving up into the cloud or moving closer to the edge. What this means is an explosion of devices that are smart, connected to the grid, and frankly have become the source of vulnerability and a pathway for attackers. Ultimately, the responsibility for protecting the grid is going to be a collective defense. And what I worry about is less about the cloud, and because cloud has been proven out to be pretty secure, although there's still hesitancy to adopt it. What I worry a lot more about is the small and medium-sized utilities that are not well equipped to deal with the threats, to be able to detect attacks and ultimately stop them. And in several of the incidents that we've seen in the last couple of years, they've been the entry point for the attackers. So what's important is that we get leverage and equip these small, medium-sized players and emerging asset owners, even private equity firms that are now own assets here in the US, to prioritize security as core part of their competitive advantage, and then begin to frankly compete on it as a way of driving digitalization and ultimately renewable power uptake.
Thanks, Leo. And clearly, cybersecurity issues are going to be an issue in cross-border transmission as well. So let me try to get back to Benny, and then we'll go to questions. Benny, I know you have some connection issues in Jakarta, but we would love to hear about what's happening in grid modernization in a regional, international perspective, particularly in ASEAN.
Right. Thank you, Bill. I hope everything is okay now. I mean, it's also a good example why the modernizing of grid is very important issue. I mean, it's gonna be I have a hard rain since afternoon, and then it's really affected. But also another side that's where our life is really dependent on this digitalized. When the internet went down, that's everything is also shut down. But bringing back to the context of the interconnection in ASEAN, I mean, maybe some of you is familiar. We have what we call it ASEAN power grid. The idea is to connect all the electricity infrastructure in all of the 10 countries in the Southeast Asia region. It is a novel idea that we have around 30 years ago. And for many people, they're saying you are not progressing fast enough. I mean, we currently have a 16 interconnection and about 70,000 megawatt is being trading exchange among the countries. But what you are looking right now is maybe also some of you is ASEAN is really pushing with the agenda having higher renewable energy penetration. I expect to the install capacity in the whole region coming from renewable energy. And there is no way that ASEAN in this region doing it individually. So the only way they can do on that, especially in particular in a very short time, this is the target. We need to install around 60 to 100 gigawatt coming from renewable energy into the system for the next 4 years. The interconnection among the country is really, really needed, be it on the bilateral or multilateral form. But then, of course, as everybody is also aware that there is a tremendous challenge that we have on this issue. One of it is, of course, about the grid reliability. I mean, we have a country where they have a good grid, while we have also another countries still the challenge on this kind of issue. Then we also talking about the resilience or readiness of the infrastructures of the how much renewable energy can we take. The current study that we are currently doing, the ASEAN Interconnection Master Plan study, we are expecting the countries, the assessment that we done, that this region will be able to absorb up to 15% of the variable renewable energy with the current infrastructures. Of course, the grid strengthening is some context is needed, but we expected we'll be able to cover it. But then the another challenge that we have is, of course, the political challenge that we have among the countries. So because it's not as simple that you connect the electricity with the other country, because it involves a lot of energy security as well on this kind of issue. So we are talking about having a regional bodies, the regional institution who are handling this kind of we call it ASEAN Transmission System Operator or ASEAN Generation Transmission as well. It's also a noble idea, but to really sit down and it's tremendous issue that we have. Again, back to the technical concern that we have. Some countries already advanced and in their infrastructures. I mean, like we have the countries like Singapore, Thailand, or Malaysia with all of the digitalization that they have it. But we also have some countries to really still in the beginning level. So putting more renewable energy will really needs an effort for everyone. So it's not a one country alone, because once we trade the electricity among the countries, so we will rely on the lowest point of the infrastructure on this region. So it is a novel challenge that we're having. I mean, the current is 7,000 megawatt, and we expect it to have 30,000 gigawatt coming from the region until the next 10th year, and really for hard work for policymakers, utility experts, and then also our role at ASEAN Center of Energy to advise the countries to push on this. I stop here. Thank you very much, Phil.
Thanks, Benny. And so I think one of the common themes here that I see across all of our speakers is that while traditional investment in increasing transmission capacity is important, we have all of these tools that can reduce the need for that additional capacity, maximize the use of our existing infrastructure. I mean, you mentioned 15 to 20% capacity improvement is possible with this trade, and I've read things like 9 to 13% reduction in the need for new kind of grid capacity with the introduction of regional trade. Let's go to the questions. Let's go to the questions from the audience. There's one here from Bruce Lindsay about what role does nuclear power have in the total decarbonized power grid? Maybe I could move this to you, Duncan. In the UK, obviously one of the biggest transmission projects that we're seeing is around the Hinkley and the Hinkley Connection project. We don't talk about nuclear as much in the context of clean energy, but clearly it's going to be an important baseload source. What role does nuclear play?
Yeah, I mean, we don't really have a concept of baseload anymore because all power can manage against demand, and particularly the rise of flexibility from EVs. But certainly in the UK, and I think in China as well, nuclear will continue to play a big role. We certainly don't talk about it enough, and we also don't talk about the fact that the life extension of existing nuclear stations, certainly in Europe, particularly in France and the UK, is playing a huge role in accelerating the decarbonisation of those economies, or maintaining a very low level of carbon in the power grids. But nuclear can continue to play a role. For the UK, certainly at National Grid, we see it as adding diversity to the mix, which gives you lots of resilience benefits. But obviously, final choices are down to politicians and policymakers really on cost, if nothing else. I think for the UK as well, what they also provide is big spinning inertia, which helps to a certain extent stabilize the grid. But you can buy that from lots of other sources. And if you're in Southeast Asia and you've got the fabulous resources of the Mekong, there you've got already a huge amount of metal spinning to generate your grid frequency and to help stabilize it. So for Europe, it can be helpful. And I'm sure for China as well. But if you've already got big hydro, actually some of the technical help that nuclear can provide is not so useful.
So not necessarily around baseload. That actually leads to the next question here from Vytautas Butrimas. And the question is, as the percentage of renewable or green power sources increase and transmission capacity is increased, how, and you mentioned a little bit about this, Duncan, but how will the load be balanced and frequency be maintained? For example, at night, when we see lower demand. Mai, you talked about the challenges of demand going down from COVID. I think Vautata's question is, will fossil fuel plants still be needed to ensure a lack of disruption? Maybe we can send this question to Fernando. Do you think that there's still a role for fossil fuel plants, or can we achieve zero carbon?
Thank you, Philip. So there have been new important developments in power electronics. So maybe sometime in the future we won't need rotating machines to provide products such as spinning inertia. But I think in the short term we'll still need to keep some rotating machines around, and that's the conclusions that we've seen in some of the recent studies of deep decarbonization in the US, in California, and in the Northeast. So I think we'll still need to keep some of those machines around.
Yeah, okay. A question from Nicole Buell for Leo. How can the government support small and medium utilities that are not well equipped to deal with cyber threats? You mentioned their particular vulnerability, but what are some existing programs that are working well, and where are there gaps in support?
Yeah, great question. So for the small, medium-sized utilities have two challenges. One is the capital challenge, and the other is the human capital challenge. And both of those challenges means that they cannot get scale in order to understand their exposure and their risk and then do something about it, let alone do something about it with speed. And the public-private sector concept can work really well to help the small, medium-sized players get leverage. Well, how do we do that? Well, one way to do that is to develop use cases and that are proven that will give the small, medium-sized utilities, which are often followers, to adopt emerging technologies like artificial intelligence for detection. But second is the opportunity to partner with companies, frankly, like ours, to drive innovation and also to use our expertise, especially around operational technology. So when we talk about the grid, we are talking about live environments that need to be protected and need to continue to provide reliable and safe power all the way out to the edge. And so use cases, capital, and blueprints for public-private partnerships. One good example of this is a partnership that we established with the New York Power Authority. We established something called the Center of Excellence, which has a school pillar, has a monitoring pillar, and has a lab or innovation pillar. That creates the virtual cycle to prove out the technology, to partner together to get scale, and then ultimately to get leverage for the small and medium-sized utilities as they look to increase their protection levels.
Great. And when we think about that role then for public policy, particularly here in the US and with the new administration, there's also big questions around public support for financing for grid modernization and build out. That leads to a question here from Zulfikar Yurnaidi. It says investment in the power grid is extremely costly, and in many cases, public and international or concessional financing cannot cover it. So I'd like to offer this question to a couple of you. How do we attract private spending? How do we engage in that public-private partnership and crowd in private financing for grid modernization? Maybe Duncan and then Mai.
Well, I mean, for us, it's, it is about clarity of policy direction from at a government or a state legislature level. And then really a constructive longer-term dialogue with the regulators or the legislators that are deciding on funding to give us structures that we can then take into private debt and equity markets and raise the financing we need. Certainly that works for us. I know it'll work for much of the world, but I'll just give that quick answer and let Mai speak.
In Vietnam, obviously, we have governments retain 100% control of the transmission. So what kind of public-private schemes can you imagine for financing alternatives in terms of building out the transmission backbone?
I think right now in Vietnam, 100% of the transmission grid control and investment control by the governments, but we need to adjust or revise the law before we can open for the PPE type. But at this moment, to resolve some of the case, we allow for the investor to build up the connection line between their projects to the grid to facilitate for evacuation power from their own projects. That is, we allow for some case now, but for the national grid is still under control and invested by the government. So I think in the coming time, we are considering to revise the electricity law. So by that time, we can open more room for the PPP mechanism and attract more private sector in the transmission grid development. That is the situation now.
Great, thank you. And maybe Francisco, Chile has really also been at the forefront of developing these PPP setup. What's the experience there, and what are some lessons maybe that can be applied elsewhere?
Well, as Duncan mentioned, I think one feature that distinguishes Chile from other countries in the region is that we have stable market rules and stable market framework. So rules are respected under those circumstances. So that's a way to reduce risks for investors. That definitely, I mean, we have empirical evidence that that definitely attracts capital. Having an open and a competitive market also helps, and just an overall political and economic stability. It's also very beneficial to try to secure this PPP deals. So.
So having an enabling environment for that kind of investment is clearly important. Great. We are coming up to time on this panel, so let me leave it there. I want to thank all of our panelists for joining me today. To Duncan Burt, Francisco Espinoza, to Nguyen Phong Mai, Leo Simonovic, and Benny Shirati, thanks for joining us. And thank you also to everybody in the audience for joining us for this timely and productive conversation. And I'd also like to thank Zach Strauss, Margaret Jackson, Laura Mercado, and Peter Gonzalez for putting this panel together. If you'd like to rewatch today's event or share the stream with a colleague, you can find a cached replay on the Atlantic Council website and the YouTube channel, as well as on our Twitter and Facebook feeds. And for the next installment in the Raising Ambition series, join the Global Energy Center on Tuesday, April 20th for 2 events, Meeting John Kerry's Hydrogen Challenge and Moving the Needle on Energy and Environmental Justice. So thanks to everyone. See you next time and have a great day. Thank you.
Thank you.